Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Major new rumours emerging as to where the power differentials really lie in 2026. Reports have it Ferrari could be 30 horsepower down on where Mercedes currently are, and that is good and bad for the rest of the season. Clearly they have arguably, if not certainly, the best chassis on the grid right now, and if they can bring engine upgrades, there is no doubt the Ferrari should be right in the mix for the championship this season. But given potential rule changes, that could hurt them badly until they get the upgraded engine in play, and it's not 100% clear yet when that is going to be. Romance and Troy, to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you are new as always. Before we start today, just wanted to share a story that hopefully you guys will enjoy. The man with the moustache is my friend Jeff from the local swimming club in this picture, and he is a speed demon. There's no other way to put it. Here he is with a classic dragster. This is the Vampire. You guys might know it because Richard Hammond famously nearly killed himself crashing it. But Jeff is also, and still to this day, a powerboat racer. Certainly in the heyday, the 70s and the 80s, here he is. A couple of great pictures actually. And his friend Tony was a Formula 1 powerboat racer, broke a ton of world records back in the 70s, and Jeff and Tony are still very much in contact today. And in fact, Tony, after having a horrific accident a couple of years back, completely shattering his whole lower body, is looking to break a world record. This time in a very different domain, but this is Jeff on the left-hand side, this is Tony, and just down the road from me here in Sale, right? So I live in Manchester, but at Sale Water Park. At 82 years of age, Tony is looking to break the world record for being the first man ever to walk on water for a 24-hour period. So he's basically helped come up with the design and has worked with like a cross trainer on water, and it's the first time it's ever been done over a 24-hour period. And he tells this amazing story here of, you know, his powerboating days and how much the charity that he's raising money for means to him. And I just thought I'd share the story because I thought it was fantastic. I've not met Tony, but of course I know Jeff, and these guys are just absolute legends. There's no doubt about it. So on the 7th, 8th of May, a month from today, Tony will be going for this world record just down the road here in the UK. So if you guys are local, you might be interested. But even if not, hopefully you guys find his story intriguing. You can read all about it here on the Just Giving page and how he got into speedboat racing back in the day with the racing mechanic Leo Villa, who was chief engineer for Malcolm Campbell and Donald Campbell, and yeah, just amazing stuff really. So anyway, still going, still trying to break records, and I just thought I'd share the fundraiser that he's working on over the next few weeks. Let's get into the Formula 1, and of course this year's regulations have been controversial to say the very least. In fact, I did see this poll with 41,000 respondents that voted the regulations with a 3 out of 10. Probably not too dissimilar to what people might have put it as back in 2014. I'm not so sure. When these regulations change, of course, they tend to be controversial, but certainly far more negative than positive has been the reaction so far, and that is inspiring change in multiple regards. There's a big meeting in London tomorrow, another meeting set up for a couple of weeks' time. Decisions will be made. Who that helps, who that hurts is a key conversation, and based on this power unit discussion, that is going to have an impact. We'll get back to that in a few minutes' time. I did want to quickly say the race put together a video on some of the quirks, if you want to call it that, of the 2026 rules, and they did describe that when Lando said after Japan that he was making overtakes accidentally, he didn't mean to, it's just the power unit decided to deploy more battery. That was actually a reference to a specific moment where he lifted off because he was getting a bit too close to Hamilton through 130R, and because of the lift, that puts the engine into this mode called power unit or power deployment pending or something like this, and because you lift off more than 2% throttle, it then gives you more juice. It's the same thing which has been affecting drivers in qualifying laps. So I think that was a reference to a specific moment rather than like that's just how it is, the drivers have no control. I'd love to hear like a good explanation from the teams or the drivers on exactly how they control the battery deployment, because look, say what you want about the racing, but the drivers need to be in charge of how they are deploying their battery if we're going to have any kind of conversation about actual quality racing and decision making and strategy and tactics as well. Because, you know, if the driver is actually choosing when to deploy the energy, you might not like the battery, but at least there's something in that. If it's the car that decides, that's got to change. And right now, based on what it appears Norris was talking about, It's a rare case that the driver doesn't choose. The driver is usually in control of that, but it's still not fully clear whether that's actually the case or not. So I want to stay optimistic and say that most of the time the driver is making the decisions, but who really knows, right? It was previously the case in the previous era with the ERS, or the KERS as it was initially called. You would press the button and that would give you the boost. So the driver was always in control of when they used the 15%, as it was then, electrical side of the battery, and when they didn't. Today it's much bigger than that. The engine and the computer has a much bigger part to play, but I'd at least hope the driver is still choosing when to press the button or not. Right now it's a little bit unclear whether that's the case, but I wanted to kind of say that it's probably not always the case on both sides of the spectrum. But let's talk about these engines, because a big article from Auto Racer drops today. There was a discussion yesterday that Ferrari are almost certainly expecting to get the ADUO. They might even get the full allocation of the additional development and upgrade opportunity, up to the full 4% deficit to Mercedes. And that would be a huge deal. I think we've been expecting that Honda would get the full 4% deficit advantage, which is double what Ferrari would get if they're only 2% behind. But Ferrari might be getting both. So, De Kessa, the guys at Auto Racer, they put together an article and they say some key things. First of all, currently they have only one power unit that's been in rotation with Leclerc and with Hamilton. They will introduce soon a second power unit into the rotation, but that will be the same as the first one. There's not going to be any crazy upgrades. We know that Honda are bringing a new power unit, but that is with reliability upgrades because they have struggled on that front. Ferrari, their reliability has been pretty good. They probably can't make too much of a case. They bring in reliability upgrades that are actually performance. So for performance, that will have to wait. They first of all have to get approved for the ADUO. They then have to figure out what that looks like. If they know they're going to get the 2% allocation, that's one thing. They're confident they will, but if they actually get the 4% allocation, then all of a sudden they can do a lot more. So they have to be a little bit patient to make the decision on what they develop, but the guys at Auto Racer put it together, and their graphic they came up with is as follows. So the entire article is linked down below, but just a snippet here. The Italians are currently at work developing a new ICE concept to increase performance and reduce degradation at high temperatures. They're confident that they can do it. And it's first of all worth pointing out here, Ferrari were expecting to be a long way behind on the power unit, I think, because of the tricky time they had developing this power unit. There was another version on the test bench that Wolf Zimmermann was leading the charge on. They got something wrong in their architecture and it kept blowing up. And relatively last minute, they had to switch to a new specification. I think Ferrari were always expecting to be behind in terms of power, and you've got the compression ratio thing that Mercedes have going on as well. So Ferrari were always going to be behind, but in fact it appears they are very far behind. And as I said at the start of the video, that is both good and bad. So these are the apparent numbers. Mercedes are roughly 585 brake horsepower, which is roughly 435 kilowatts. Now keep in mind the battery is 350 kilowatts and the ICE was meant to be 400 kilowatts, but it's not limited at 400 kilowatts. So if you can get above that, which we think Mercedes have, then they have a huge amount of extra power to play with here. The Red Bull, by the way, is reportedly very, very close. It's within only a handful of horsepower of the Mercedes. And first of all, that is extremely impressive. From Ben Hodgkinson, even I think Horner's got to deserve credit for putting together a team that is capable of actually building something like that. And the fact that they're so far ahead of everybody else, we think, is a huge, it's a success story for Red Bull Powertrains Ford. It's the complete opposite for the chassis department, because as Auto Racer describe, it is a disastrous car. It is raining cats and dogs for Red Bull because in fact their engine is so good, they're probably not going to get the upgrade opportunities, which the other teams will get. In fact, the RB22 is probably, they say, the worst car in Red Bull's history in terms of correlation and production. So that arguably could be the story of the day in and of itself, but we've talked a fair bit about Red Bull and their crisis over these last few days. But Ferrari, if they're down at 555, that's a 30 horsepower deficit. I mean, that's a huge deficit in theoretical lap time, and undoubtedly, I think, contributes to basically all of their deficit right now. It's got to be said. You know, looking at these numbers, you would be surprised if Ferrari don't have the best chassis. The fact that they've even been competitive with Mercedes with these numbers is very impressive for what chassis that they've put together and the aero performance of that SF26. The Audi's a bit further back. Then we have Honda, which could be as much as 95 horsepower down. There was some talk about that even from Motorsport Italia, which kind of aligns with those numbers that we have seen. Even rumours that before the season started, or like let's say back at the Bahrain test or back in Australia, it was actually even worse than this. They've actually made some progress. They're still 100 horsepower down. So like that is horrific. And well, we'll discuss some of the further problems with this in just a second. But Aston Martin are nowhere, of course, with that Honda power unit right now. Red Bull are nowhere as well. They've built the worst car ever. They're probably not going to get any upgrade opportunities. It's a complete shambles from every perspective. Ferrari, on the other hand, it's a pro and a con, because first of all, they need time to develop a new ICE. Can they develop an ICE that's good enough? I think Red Bull have shown that you can. I think that's what's actually really positive about this story in terms of a championship battle at some point, is that, look, if Red Bull can be within 10 horsepower of the Mercedes ICE, and we think Mercedes are using this compression ratio trick that Red Bull didn't quite get right, and that might be shut down in the summer, whatever, from the 1st of June, they're changing the way that those are tested. There might be changes there might not. But if Red Bull can pull together an engine within a couple of % of Mercedes over just a few years, their first ever time building an engine, and such a complicated engine with these regulations at that, surely Ferrari can do it, right? So they were working on a difficult timeline, as we've discussed earlier on, that, you know, the Wolf Zimmerman project failed and all this. So theoretically they can, and presumably they will. And the other key note here of these numbers is that I believe now, having, you know, read a few of these articles, that the gap in terms of percentage reduction is based on the ICE and not the electrical side, which makes sense, but I was like confused a little bit, because if you are, let's say it's a 1,000 horsepower car, everyone has 350 kilowatts apart from maybe Honda from their battery, the MG UK. So it's like, are we doing the percentage on the total 1,000 horsepower, or are we doing it based just on the ICE? I think we're doing it just on the ICE. That means it's better for Ferrari, right? Because a 30 horsepower deficit on, you know, a less than 600 horsepower car, we are talking over 4%, 4, 5%, maybe even 6%, something in that kind of ballpark is where the deficit appears to be. And that would be enough, you would think, for Ferrari to get double the upgrades. Now, as I say, it's not even confirmed yet. In Miami, that's going to give more information as to where the power units sit. Then a decision will be made on what ADUO gets granted to the teams. Then Ferrari can actually properly put together the new engine. The reality is, getting a new power unit before July is not realistic, right? So they are going to suffer with this deficit for some time, but less than they could have been, because we could have been in Bahrain this weekend, we could have been in Saudi next time out. That's not happening anymore. So there's 2 rounds where Ferrari don't have to suffer as badly, but the timeline does mean that by the time they get to bring this engine, it is going to be a while away. But it does appear that Ferrari are definitely getting the 2% allocation. They're possibly getting the 4% allocation as well. And if they get that, that means they can bring 2 upgrades to the engine in season this year and 2 additional upgrades next year as well. The article also discussed that Mercedes have spent so much money developing this engine, really, that they don't have that much to play with, right? And also they're not getting the ADUO, which gives you even more money to spend because they've got the best engine. So Mercedes might not be able to keep pushing that number up and up and up further on, and Ferrari in July, they're hoping that's when they're going to bring their big engine. So look, by the time we get to the summer break, Ferrari, especially if they can keep their chassis right in the mix, they should be in a really good position. Now, look, winning this year's championship, it might just be too much to ask, to be honest, unless they can, I don't know, dominate in Monaco or something and put some big points back on the board. But I think it's going to be a fair bit of damage limitation until that new engine arrives, and if they get the 4% ADUO, then they should be cooking for this year and for next year in addition. It is, however, worth saying that we might be altering the regulations. This is why, as we said yesterday, Toto Wolff is not actually totally opposed to the regulation changes. You might expect, oh, Mercedes are going to oppose everything because they're currently winning. But actually, no, Toto is, well, politically, he's obviously playing a game. I do think that Toto has some level of sporting opinion. He's like, yeah, we kind of do want to be flat out in qualifying. But I do think the politics and the competition, at least how competitive Mercedes are, does trump that side of the story. But also I think Toto has to realise Mercedes is more valuable if Formula 1 is more valuable. And right now, the fans, the teams, the stakeholders aren't really very happy with where Formula 1 is heading. That is a consideration as well. But one of the key discussions has been, what if we took the battery at 350 kilowatts and we reduced it down to 200 kilowatts, maybe 250 kilowatts? That would go a long way to fixing these regulations. It would take the balance between the ICE and the MGUK from 55-45 up to, you could even push maybe 70-30, something in that kind of ballpark. That means the power lasts longer, it means you get less horrible clipping and lift and coast and all these other problems. You can also reduce the amount of recharge that the MGUK can do, and with all that being said, you get to a set of regulations which actually look more like the Formula 1 that we have known. The problem, of course, here is that if you reduce the power of the battery, where everyone is basically the same, you, by consequence, increase the relative power of the ICE, right? Because in terms of a percentage overall difference, the Ferrari and the Mercedes batteries are basically the same. The MGUK is the same, it's 350 kilowatts. But if you reduce that down to 200, in terms of overall power, percentage terms, the Mercedes now becomes even stronger, right? So this is probably why Toto is not too opposed, because it's like, well, we've got the strongest ICE, that stands to give us even more advantage if we change the rules. So this is the problem, right, is that the ICE was always going to be an incredibly important part of this year, but if you reduce the electrical side, you make that even more important. So that's Ferrari's problem, really, that they should, once they bring that new engine, that they should get the upgrade opportunities for in the middle of the season, they should be right there. But until then, if they change the rules, which they might have to for various reasons, safety and sporting, Ferrari will be exposed because the other teams, even such as Alpine and certainly McLaren, with the Mercedes power unit, will be even stronger. And that 30 horsepower deficit is going to bite even harder. Now, of course, they've got aero upgrades in the works, and clearly there's a phenomenal chassis that Ferrari are running, but it does appear that this could be a short-term pain for long-term gain type situation for Ferrari when, yeah, they started off the season nicely with a handful of podiums. They will likely continue delivering podiums, you would think, between now and the mid-season side before they can properly start challenging, they hope, for race wins. But it might be a little bit of pain before they get to that point, especially if the regulations get changed, which would not favour Ferrari in many respects. So very much interested to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.